get you?
Let's see, steak.
Many people stand at the butcher counter and scratch their heads when confronted with the zillion different steak cuts available to them. So to make things a little easier, here is a rundown of the 10 best cuts of steak.
Steak night!
Sirloin steak.
Have you ever had sirloin steak, honey?
The sirloin is like the workhouse of the steak universe. As one of the most popular cuts, calling a sirloin is never that simple. Divided between the more tender top sirloin and less tender bottom sirloin, many people find the bottom cut the hardest to handle and digest compared to many of the others on this list. However, it's hard to discount such a lean, sturdy steak, since what it might be lacking in flavor is more than made up for in the protein delivery department. In comparison to fattier cuts, the bottom sirloin is a very lean, protein-rich beef cut, popular among bodybuilders and people who don't want to let go of their beef but don't want to add on too much fat.
Steak and eggs and eggs and steak.
Of course, a lot of people simply sear it in a skillet, which is the easiest way to cook it, but this method won't yield the most tender steak. Slowly braising it in a bit of liquid causes the taut muscle fibers to break down, tenderizing the meat gradually over a few hours. It belongs on this list because it is efficient and so much cheaper than most other cuts, as well as being efficient in the protein-to-fat ratio. For the thrifty people out there, this is exactly why a steak like a sirloin deserves to be called delicious. And it's so respectable. There's even a sir in the name.
With all due respect, sir.
Skirt steak.
Skirt steak. I get it.
Skirt steak is as unforgiving as a steak can be, and it needs to be cooked and often sliced specifically. Otherwise, it risks being transformed into something chewy and unpleasant. If it's mishandled during the prep and cooking process, it's probably not going to be something you want to serve at any dinner party. But if done right, it can be a bountiful, tasty cut to share with a large group of people. The steak cut is fairly long and flat compared to many of its juicier steak counterparts, and although it's often fibrous and full of a lot of visible grain, it is packed full of flavor and has an interesting texture. The skirt is something most people will know from its popularity in Mexican cuisine, especially as a fajita filling.
Fajitas! Be careful! Very hot plate! Very hot!
But there are so many ways to tackle this cut if you know what you're doing. Because of its inherent toughness, it benefits from being marinated for several hours in order to break down the muscle fibers, then seared very quickly and sliced against the grain, or simply braised and broken down in liquid on the stovetop oven or slow cooker. Once mastered, this is a supremely tasty cut of meat and adaptable for many different kinds of dishes. Not to mention that this cut is usually cheaper than other cuts of meat, so it makes a good case for itself as a way to save a few dollars at the butcher counter. Just make sure your chef skills are in order. Tri-tip steak.
Who's ready for tri-tip, huh? What?
The tri-tip steak is an underrated cut of steak from the back-bottom sirloin of the cow, often found for very cheap. It has a resoundingly great taste to it, full of beef flavor, and is surprisingly tender for the price range. Cut from the tri-tip roast, it is otherwise known as a triangle steak, which comes from the overall triangular appearance of it. There isn't much in terms of connective tissue, so you don't have to worry about cooking it for too long either. With such a quick and easy cooking process, it's perfect for those busy weeknights.
I don't want to do anything dying.
Also, for those who are a little more concerned about their health and want to cut down on fat or stick to high-protein cuts, the tri-tip is ideal as it is quite lean compared to some of the fattier cuts of beef available. Popularized in California some decades ago and previously known as the California Cut or Santa Maria Steak, it was named after the town where it became famous. The town's annual barbecue festival has since made this steak a standard at butcher counters. It's more and more in demand, so make sure to get your hands on one the first chance you get. New York strip steak.
All I want is one New York strip steak, a quarter-inch thick.
This classic strip loin goes by many names, including the Kansas City strip, the Omaha loin, short loin, club steak, or probably most famously, the classic New York strip. However, technically, it is officially known as the shell of the cow and as shell steak in the UK and Ireland. It's also known as the larger half of the T-bone or Porterhouse steak, the slightly tougher cousin to the filet on the opposite side. Looking past its crazy long history and all of the details details behind what to call it. A New York strip on its own is a really nice cut of meat with a beautiful and simple thick look to it, often with fat covering an outer side of it, which tenderizes the meat as it's being cooked.
Try a little tenderness.
It's particularly well known in New York City, where the famed steakhouse Delmonico's made it their prized cut and namesake, known locally simply as the Delmonico steak. It's not terribly difficult to cook, but it's important to be careful with this cut. It cannot be cooked too long, or the lack of marbling within the steak can cause it to get tough. But cooking it medium rare to medium will do it more than enough justice, and the simplicity of its cooking, just a few minutes on the grill or in a pan, will bring out the best in this beast. Porterhouse Steak.
Porterhouse, rare, quickly. Same.
Eating a porterhouse steak is, on viewing alone, a perfect example of what it is like to be a carnivore. The sheer look of the thing will send a vegetarian cowering. Essentially the same as a T-bone steak, only larger, it is made up of two different cuts of steak, tenderloin and strip steak, split by a big T-shaped bone. Porterhouses are considered superior to T-bones because of their size, but no matter how you take it, this is a hunk of meat that's impossible to ignore. It's a divisive steak with ardent lovers and haters, either for it or against it in almost equal measure, and it often comes down to how it's cooked.
It's not how it looks, it's how it tastes.
Cooking it is a true test of a chef's skill, since the different sizes of the cuts found inside the steak each have different cooking requirements and are made up of fairly lean meat. 1 minute too long on one side and the delicate tenderloin might turn gray and become an overcooked mess with an undone strip. However, once mastered, the steak delivers on its macho promise, and it can be amazing. It's popular throughout the world, especially in North and South America and Italy, where the special cattle raised in Tuscany produce some of the best porterhouses in the world, known as steak Florentine.
The best of the best of the best, sir.
Flat iron steak.
Flat-faced, flat-nosed, flathead.
Like many of these steaks, the trusty flat iron is known by many different names depending on where you are in the world. It's known as the oyster blade steak in Australia and New Zealand, the feather blade and the butler steak in the UK, or simply as the flat iron in the US. Stripped from the shoulder area of the animal where chuck meat is derived from, it requires some preparation before being tackled due to where the cut is located. The shoulder is an area of the cow that can yield meat that is tougher than other cuts. The flat iron in particular comes from the top blade and is surrounded by a gristle-bound membrane that needs to be removed before cooking to ensure a more tender meal.
What a tender world that would be.
But the flat iron packs so much flavor that it definitely belongs in the hierarchy of great steak cuts, and is often found for a relatively inexpensive cost at the butcher's shop. The flat iron contains an even, well-marbled texture that can be grilled very easily and be extraordinarily tender. The big difference between a fillet and a flat iron is that the flat iron is considered tastier, with a heavier beef flavor than that found in the tenderloin. So its popularity is warranted for that reason alone. Ribeye steak.
Trying to choose between a ribeye and a sirloin steak.
The ribeye, along with the tenderloin, is one of the most popular steaks in America, and for good reason. Many people consider the ribeye to be one of the most flavorful cuts available. It is thickly marbled, often with quite a bit of fat between the connective tissue, which, when cooked properly, melts nicely between bites, giving it the taste and feel of a buttery, tender treat. Named after the rib section of the cow, it's a cut that contains several muscles, and its tenderness derives from the fact that this part of the animal is less worked over than some of the undercuts that require stricter cooking in order to make them tender. The ribeye is known as a forgiving cut, owing to the eye in the center, which is where most of the fat marbling occurs, making it juicy no matter what is done to it.
Fat and juicy.
Plus, much like many other cuts, there's a big difference between what constitutes a ribeye in the US and what makes a ribeye in the UK or elsewhere. Often overseas, ribeye means it will come with a giant hunk of the bone, potentially making the steak even juicier, however somewhat harder to tackle at a dinner table. But in America, the standard steak is cut from between a certain section of the cow's ribs, which contains the most intramuscular fat. Bone in or not, whatever your definition, the ribeye is a popular steak cut. Hanger steak.
Caught a hanger, Sarge. But what a hanger?
The hanger steak is typically known in France as the hanging tenderloin or an onglet, and in Italy a lombatello, and sometimes a butcher's cut, because butchers are known to like it so much that they keep these cuts for themselves instead of for customers. It's a hugely flavorful steak, popular in bistros throughout the world, and it cooks and eats simply, with a ruggedness to its shape and texture which is very satisfying for carnivorous taste buds. It's also known as a cost-effective cut, unlike the similarly flavored ribeye, which can go for premium prices.
Steak?
Money's too tight for steak.
But many would argue that the hanger steak is even tastier than the ribeye, with a more interesting texture. The cut is taken from the plate, which is the upper belly of the animal, and is very versatile, unlike flank steak. For a long time, this cut had suffered a bad rap, with many people considering it a crude throwaway cut, hence the butchers saving it for themselves. However, it has since come around to be known as one of the most prized parts of the animal, and chefs do like a good challenge.
Challenge accepted.
Filet Mignon.
I'm over here feasting on filet mignon.
The filet mignon cut is by far the steak most synonymous with luxury, and an entire roast of filet mignon can cost well over $100. Even a small chunk of it is out of most people's price range. But professional chefs have often considered it an overrated cut. Yes, it is tender and forgiving no matter how you cook it, and yes, it melts in your mouth, and yes, you can slice a prime filet and eat it raw, as tartare, or really any way you could possibly want. Without question, it is a beautiful piece of meat. But flavor-wise, is it the best cut out there?
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Many would argue no. Beef aficionados throughout the world might make the case that bavette, hanger, or ribeye is where the real flavor can be found. The filet mignon might well be the most renowned, the most tender as the name implies, and among the most perfect-looking cuts available, but when it comes to the purity of condensed beef flavor, there might be other places to look. That being said, there is no question that the price of this cut of steak is often justified. It is such a tender cut that it approaches myth. Bavette Steak.
Scottish steak.
Otherwise known as flap meat steak or vacchio steak in Argentina, this undercarriage cut has been historically underrated as a steak until somewhat recently. It's considered a part of the flank, but it is distinct from a typical flank steak and derived from a particular part rather than the whole section. It's fibrous, made up of the abdominal muscles of the cow, and if you cook it incorrectly or not long enough, you can end up with a chewy, inedible meat product, which everybody agrees would be unbearably sad. However, chefs around the world prize this cut for its deep flavor and the skill required to cook it properly.
I got skills.
Marinated, grilled, and sliced against the grain makes for a deeply flavorful protein, and it can also be braised and cooked slowly until it's basically falling apart and melting in your mouth. Either way, it's a delicious cut that's deserving of its reputation. So much so that prices of this steak have risen over the last decade as butchers were faced with an increased demand for it. Perhaps most popular in Argentina, one of the clear steak capitals of the world, it's often served very simply with either a green salsa or chimichurri alongside, or with mustard, pepper, or béarnaise sauce in France. The ultimate meal, some would say, and at the top of the flavor mountain.
I'm sure it's perfect.
Check out more great videos. Just tap or click. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell.